Path of Exile 2 is a really beautiful game with an incredibly solid foundation that I'm sure will eventually go on to become truly great. As it stands now, it's a little too imbalanced for its own good, and some of its design decisions are at odds with each other and will end up turning away a good chunk of players. Despite that, its major issues are relatively minor in the grand scheme of things in terms of what it would take to address them, mostly numerical tuning, and a large part of this video will inevitably end up focusing on the negatives of the game in the hope that offering constructive criticism will help push it into a more positive direction. So while I may come off overly critical here, I want you to rest assured that the game at its core is good. It just needs a little polishing and a little more content to become great, which is good news since this is only its early access period. As is customary for a Path of Exile review, I'll introduce myself by saying I'm Last Protagonist. I've played a decent amount of Path of Exile 1 and enjoyed it quite a bit. I've fully cleared the maps a couple times, even downing a few pinnacle bosses here and there, but I've always struggled with focusing on one character long enough to take down the uber pinnacle bosses. In addition to Path of Exile 1, I've also played a tiny bit of Last Epoch, stopping after I cleared the monoliths, its version of the endgame mapping system. As of the time of this review, I've got a level 86 Genling Legionnaire that's got all 4 Ascendancies and cleared tier 15 maps, a level 70 Monk, and a level 20 Sorceress currently sitting in Act 2. I really enjoyed my time with Path of Exile 2 so far. WASD movement is as much of a game changer as I've hoped it would be, and the general feel of combat has been strategic, weighty, and pretty damn satisfying. Quite frankly, the art and sound teams have done a phenomenal job bringing the world to life, and I'm truly impressed at how well they've made each enemy type visually distinct from each other, from their silhouettes to the way they move that makes it relatively easy to identify them from one's peripheral vision alone. Status effects look great. Frozen enemies look really good when they're crystallized, and the crunch they make as they explode into tiny little pieces when they're shattered is beyond satisfying. Whenever I happen to freeze an enemy as they're making an attack midair, I can't help but smile a bit to myself, and it's no surprise to me it's taken grinding your game so long to make its early access simply from how much attention to detail went to every little thing like freezing enemies during individual attack frames, and also making the effort to make it look good when it happens. Even from the first moment I loaded Path of Exile 2 and started moving around, I couldn't help but notice how fluid the animations were walking one direction and having my character face another. Of course, this isn't to say that visual improvements couldn't be made in other areas. Rare monsters and magic monsters can be impossible to tell apart from normal monsters, and as I've gotten to maps, I've discovered that the most common reason I'll get one-shot is from failing to recognize a singular rare monster in a pack of normal ones. Ideally, I'd prefer all rare monsters to have a visual indicator above their head that signifies what mods they have, similar to a curse mark, as well as a faint golden aura outlining them to help make them stand out, and maybe a slight blue tint for magic monsters as well. As I mentioned earlier, the combat is really good, and although it was a little rough going through the early parts of the campaign on my mercenary and monk because they take a little longer to set up than other classes, I still really enjoyed the early pace of the game and having to deal with mobs on a more strategic level than the other ARPGs I've played in the past. Fighting these skeletal knights with big shields that could reflect attacks, for example, made me learn to engage with them from behind, or to kite them toward me while I threw grenades behind them. In Act 2, if I saw a giant skeleton walking towards me, I knew it was incredibly likely that I'd find a desiccated leech nearby that would summon tornadoes if left alone, so I'd have to bob and weave between the giants to take out the bigger threats, and this experience even carried over into Act 3 but became greatly diminished as my builds matured in cruel difficulty, and even more so when I got to maps, where there isn't much strategizing beyond, get rid of the ranged mobs first, and prioritize the ones that deal chaos damage. I don't know how they could realistically address this issue to make the maps be more like the campaign, but endgame mapping is its own can of worms that I'll probably address in another video. I thought the difficulty of the campaign was in a pretty good place overall, but there are some pain points that deserve addressing. Now, before I really get into it, there's something else that needs addressing first. With the way that loot is obtained primarily through RNG right now, I think grinding your games is going to have a really difficult time sifting through feedback because they'll have one group of fans saying X or Y should be buffed or nerfed, and another group saying to change nothing at all, largely I think because of how the RNG of their loot has influenced their experience. And I'm not saying this to be more big-brained, mega-minded, or more enlightened than anyone else. I'm saying it because I've experienced both sides of this after having played through the campaigns on multiple characters. If I only took my experience with Count Gianor on my mercenary, for example, I'd probably have argued he's in a really good spot balance-wise because I managed to beat him on my first try, but it wasn't a cakewalk. I just happened to perform well avoiding his mechanics and attacking him from range. This wasn't the case for my monk, however. As embarrassing as it is to admit, it took me 3 hours of attempts against him before I finally gave up and went back to farm the manor for some better items with which I downed him on my second try. What was the difference? Honestly, I think it largely came down to boots. My mercenary had managed to find some boots with 10% increased movement speed by that point in the game, whereas my monk had not. This gave me the edge necessary to more reliably avoid some mechanics and made the fight feel better overall. From getting my face shoved into the dirt with my monk, I learned that you can get easily one-shot by Geonor's icy beams of light stacking on top of each other, which feels unnecessarily punishing for that point in the game. Because of this, I do think they should either lower the damage of that one move specifically, or ensure that it can't stack on the player twice. But I suppose even this suggestion wouldn't be entirely necessary if I could have bought a charm that removed freeze from the shot. The best I could get at the time was a bit of cold resistance. Anyway, my point is, if I'd only been playing my mercenary, it would have been easy to invalidate someone else's opinion who had a similar experience as my monk on Count Geonor. And if for some reason you guys want to watch that experience, it's archived on the live section on my channel, and I'll add a link to it in the video description. It's, not pretty. I'm not sure how grinding your games would feel about this, but I do think the base movement speed of the characters is a bit on the low end, and I think I could use that extra 10% boost baseline that helped me beat Count Geonor. Now, if getting that extra 10% movement speed meant we had to nerf the speed of boots to compensate, I'd be fine with that. As it is right now, movement speed feels like a non-negotiable stat on a pair of boots because movement is unironically the best defensive stat in the game, and because of that, I think all boots should have some form of movement mechanic integrated into them at a base level. This could range from the milquetoast 5 to 25% increased movement speed, to dodge roll speed increased 10 to 40%, or even your dodge roll is increased by 0.4 meters. We can even get unique items that say stuff like, your blink cooldown is reduced by 5, 10, or 20%. I imagine more options like this will be added in time, but I just wanted to give some more food for thought now. I've already hit on this in my video complaining about the state of loot in the game, but it really sucks to get a really good yet dead item because it doesn't have the modifiers you need. A juicy pair of boots with 6 stats is useless to me if it doesn't have movement speed, and I've already stacked virtually as much movement speed as I can get on the passive tree. In addition to that, some stats are so cracked you can go through virtually the entire campaign without upgrading your gear if you manage to get a good enough item early on, which I think ties back into that issue about how players are giving varied feedback about their experience playing the game. This is going to be one hell of a hot take, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think items which increase skill levels are way too powerful early on, and players who get gear with 3 to 6 additional skill levels will outpace the majority of the content of the campaign. In late game, the mana costs for these additional levels are way too high. Instead, I'd prefer it if additional skill levels were only obtainable through extraordinary crafting methods in the late game, and that the base stats of weapons or skill gems are raised to compensate for it. Even then, being able to get plus 7 levels on an item feels a bit ridiculous, especially when you think about the RNG necessary to get an item with a drop that high, and I'd prefer something a bit more reasonable like plus 2 skill levels being the maximum. But that's just me though. Maybe you feel differently. Let me know in the comments. Moving on to stats, I think Path of Exile 2 has a lot of the same issues Path of Exile 1 has, where it's a little too unclear how they actually function. It's kind of low-hanging fruit since it's getting dunked on by so many others right now, deservedly so, but armor is the easiest example of this. Unlike fire, lightning, cold, and chaos resistances, which work exactly how they sound by reducing damage proportionally to the amount of resistance you have, armor doesn't work that way with physical damage at all. Rather than consistently reducing the damage of hits and slams, armor works on a weird curve that's only effective at mitigating relatively minor hits, you know, the things you can reliably survive already, and is relatively ineffective at mitigating the damage of things which can one-shot you. Realistically, this kind of makes sense because armor in real life would be good for stopping the damage of nicks, cuts, and glancing blows, but wouldn't be very effective against getting hit by a cannonball. But let's be real here, Path of Exile is a game. It's unintuitive as hell and borderline deceptive to new players the way armor works, and it isn't even effective at mitigating things like damage over time. Not to mention it can be broken by certain enemy effects like armor break. Evasion kind of also suffers from this as well, where there's an alleged dodge percent that appears on your character screen, but it varies based on the accuracy rating of the mobs you're fighting, and presumably still works based on an entropy system like in Path of Exile 1, where you will get hit if you're being swarmed and avoiding a lot of small hits in quick succession. The entropy system doesn't bother me too much, and it does make sense to a degree, but I'd much prefer that my chance to dodge enemy attacks was accurately reflected on my character screen, or that accuracy wasn't a thing at all. Actually, yeah. Accuracy as a stat totally sucks and is a terrible holdover from Path of Exile 1. For those who don't know, accuracy affects how often you can reliably hit an enemy. Big surprise, I know. But the weird thing to me about it is that it only applies to attacks, and spells are all guaranteed to hit their mark, provided you don't miss a skill shot or something. I think what really annoys me about accuracy in Path of Exile 2 is that aside from being a virtually dead stat on an item, it's the only bonus you get from leveling dexterity. Intelligence can be leveled to increase your mana pool, which is a little boring but whatever, and strength can be used to gain max life. However, if someone were to allocate mind over matter from the skill tree, they'd also be able to use their mana pool as an extra life resource, meaning there's far more utility in leveling strength and intelligence over dexterity. I respect the devs' desires to not have base stats contribute to damage, and I've seen interviews where game director Jonathan Rogers talks about the team not knowing what stats should be associated with dexterity other than accuracy and evasion, but I'll say it again. Accuracy sucks. If we really need a replacement stat, why not have dex reduce the amount of damage taken from critical attacks? I'd prefer to double dip and let dex increase either critical hit chance, crit damage, or even both, but I imagine that would be way too powerful in the current sandbox. Since we're sort of on the topic of stats in the passive skill tree, I have to admit I was a little underwhelmed with its current state. Obviously with half the classes missing, it'll go under serious renovations in the future, but its current state feels rather bland compared to Path of Exile 1, which had some rather spicy nodes you could get early on like Minion Instability, Avatar of Fire, and Supreme Ego. Granted, while Minion Instability still exists in PoE 2 as a support gem, which I appreciate, and Avatar of Fire is on the tree as well, one thing I've noticed is that these more build-defining nodes seem much further away and require a lot more investment to unlock. I think that's fine to a degree, but some of these keystones are so niche that it makes pathing through some sections of the skill tree pretty boring. On my Mercenary, for example, I have Oasis, Elemental Equilibrium, Glancing Blows, Vault Pact, Unwavering Stance, Bulwark, and Iron Reflexes in my immediate vicinity. All of these are either completely irrelevant or negligible for the average crossbow build, so my most exciting nodes are the ones that reduce the time it takes to reload my crossbow or fire my grenades. To make matters slightly worse, some of my most impactful nodes come with some pretty significant drawbacks, which is understandable, but I generally don't think the upsides are worth having the downsides be as large as they are. For example, I was really happy to pick up the heavy ammunition node since it increases my projectile damage and stun buildup by 40%, thinking it'd be a huge buff to my flashbang grenades and all that, but what I didn't know at the time was that attack speed essentially double dips on crossbows. So not only does it affect a weapon's rate of fire, it also influences how quickly you can reload it. This is fine, and I kind of like it to a degree, but since crossbows already take a while to fire and reload, it's a little deceptive how detrimental these kind of nodes can be. I took the heavy ammunition node for a while because I felt the upsides outweighed the downsides, but I can't ever see myself selecting the power shots node, which decreases attack speed by 15%, yet increases crit damage by 80% unless I'm focusing specifically on a crit-based build. I know 8 or 15% reductions can sound pretty negligible on paper, but it makes a world of difference in terms of the game feel, particularly when using crossbow bolts with low magazine sizes and slower rates of fire, and there aren't a ton of nodes that increase attack speed either, so these types of trade-offs end up making some notable passive nodes feel rather lackluster and disappointing. Because the passive tree has comparatively less power than Path of Exile 1, this has a disproportionate effect on gearing as it relates to progression. Rather than incrementally gaining power through leveling up, you're much more likely to be carried or gated by the current gear you possess. This might sound a little dramatic in a vacuum, so I should clarify that you'll probably be fine throughout the campaign even with pretty bad gear, but as you progress toward the endgame and higher tier maps, there's very little you can find in the passive tree that'll meaningfully affect your progression. Obviously, there are some outliers in terms of defensive nodes like acrobatics and mind over matter, but generally speaking, unlike in Path of Exile 1, there are hardly any ways to gain more elemental resistances from the passive tree, and with endgame map progression more or less being hard-gated by your survivability rather than your damage, This is going to have a huge impact on many players' experience, particularly if they're playing solo self-found. Well, I think the campaign, or at least the first 3 acts of it, does a great job balancing its difficulty since gear doesn't matter that much. A lot of cracks in the fundamental design system of the game really begin to show in the endgame. I've already made a video touching on it briefly, but I think the biggest issue Path of Exile 2 has right now is the way it distributes loot. Not only does meaningful loot drop too scarcely for the character you're currently using, but trying to upgrade the gear you have is way too dependent on RNG, and you're more likely to brick a piece of equipment by giving it a mod you don't care about than when you do. To compound the issue further, I'd bet the vast majority of newer players aren't going to understand the difference between an item with a good set of base stats, so you have one layer of RNG finding a good base piece of equipment on top of another layer of RNG for finding currency to craft with, on top of another layer of getting the mods you want, on top of another layer of getting the values for the mods you want when it comes to crafting on equipment, if you can even call it that. So to break down the base equipment thing to you folk who are newer to Path of Exile, here's a post I found on the PoE 2 subreddit by Raffer titled, "I despise this bow with all my being." If you look at it, the bow has 186% increased physical damage, 26 to 63 flat physical damage, 111 accuracy, 30 dexterity, leeches damage, gains life, you get it. This bow sounds amazing at first, doesn't it? So why do they hate it? Well, if you look at the top of the bow, it deals 74 to 180 physical damage and 41 to 69 chaos damage. The 186 increased physical damage modifier is already baked into the damage calculations at the top of the weapon, so if you add the damage values together, divide by 2, and multiply it by the attack speed of the weapon, 1.2, you get an effective DPS rate of 218.4 damage per second, not including critical strike chance. So even though this bow has fantastic modifiers, because the cultist bow only deals chaos damage for its base damage type, its 186% increased physical damage only modifies the 26 to 63 flat damage added from its other modifier. If the chaos damage of the bow was physical damage instead, its effective DPS would be 341.4 damage per second, a 56% difference just because of the base type of the weapon. To make matters worse, you can't change the bow's chaos damage to physical damage or vice versa, and you can't even get additional chaos damage modifiers on a bow. How the hell is anyone supposed to know that? Even if we added a class that's built around chaos damage into the game, it's not like they can make good use of the bow either, because there's no way to meaningfully boost its damage, effectively making cultist bows dead drops for all but the characters with the worst gear. And of course, me pointing this out comes with an implication that there should be chaos damage modifiers on weapons, which opens up a whole other can of worms about not wanting chaos mods on other weapons. Obviously, the solution here is quite simple. Make it so that damage modifiers align more with the base type of a weapon, and I fully expect these things to be ironed out over time, but my biggest issue still stands that the vast majority of players aren't going to understand the way these numbers are presented to them. While the weapon values are simple enough, this issue extends to other equipment as well, and too many players are going to tunnel vision on fixing their elemental resistances to realize that the body armor with 45% fire resistance and 35 lightning resistance but only 300 armor and 100 energy shield isn't that good in the long run either. So if you can't get significantly more powerful from the passive skill tree and you're at the mercy of RNG to find useful gear, and even more at the mercy of RNG to meaningfully craft useful gear, how are you realistically meant to progress your character? The trade site. I can't understate how disappointing it is having to stop actively playing the game to go to another site to have the chance to look for an upgrade and hope I have the requisite amount of currency to perform the trade, and hope that the sellers are also available to trade. While some of the issues with trade have been ameliorated with the in-game currency exchange market, the fact of the matter is that the benefit the exchange market provides is that it makes it so that players can avoid having to trade items directly, which should be a big red flag that you might now want to base your entire in-game economy around trade. Imagine messaging over 20 people just to buy a waystone so you could continue mapping progression, only to not get a response. It doesn't really matter that the 30th guy responded and it only took 5 or 10 minutes. The entirety of that experience was incredibly tedious and kept me from playing the game. The worst part is, I could easily see how adding in an auction house could make the game worse. While I'm generally a big fan of its auction house, If you've played World of Warcraft or any other MMO with a large trading platform, you'll know how easy it is for some people to corner markets and price gouge players. I thought GGG might have solved that issue by tying the amount of auctions one could have to the amount of gold that's only generated from playing the game, but realistically, we all know bots are gonna bot, and it'll always be a game of whack-a-mole and trying to stop market manipulators. I've also seen other games get kind of ruined by their in-game auction houses like Last Epoch, and although I do hate it to some degree, a part of me also appreciates visiting other people's hideouts to trade because you can see some really neat things. My biggest gripe with trade, other than how annoying it can be, is that although Path of Exile 1 and 2 play like primarily single-player games, they seem to be entirely balanced around the multiplayer market, so unless you have the knowledge and skill to make absolutely ridiculous builds and the meta-knowledge to leverage the endgame systems, you're going to be outpaced by those who group up. I know right now there's a lively discussion going on around whether the item rarity stat should even be in the game, but one sentiment that I surprisingly haven't seen brought up much in relation to it is how much more efficiently people can milk it when they're grouped together. If the in-game economy is going to be balanced around 6 players giga-juicing maps with or without item rarity, there's no way an individual can compete with that. I guess that's fine if that's the route the devs want to go, but having the endgame gear progression being focused on trading feels really at odds with a game that doesn't advertise its trade features at all. And it's this kind of mismatch between how the game presents itself versus how it plays out in reality that's bound to give players whiplash. Sure, a decent chunk of players will eventually figure stuff out and adapt and overcome, but the systems are not intuitive, and I'd bet an even bigger chunk of players are going to hit a wall with their gear or their build and not know how to proceed and drop the game as a result. I've kind of always wondered how many hours grinding gear games wants their players to spend each league, and why so many of their systems are determined by RNG. Generally, when I look at a system or mechanic in a game and ask, does this make the game better? Very seldom do I find that the answer is yes when it concerns RNG, yet it's so prevalent in their games it kind of burns me out. This would make a lot more sense to me if Path of Exile 1 or 2 operated based on a subscription fee, or some form of advertising where they'd continue to passively generate income the longer you played, but they don't, so I'm left a little disappointed and confused. Why do I have to spend tens or literally hundreds of hours searching for citadels on my Atlas map for a chance to attempt the endgame pinnacle content? Why do I have to do tens or hundreds of maps to get to a point where I could potentially get an omen that can allow one exalted orb to add 2 random modifiers to an item instead of 1? How much more RNG do I need to get the omen that will allow a chaos orb to remove the lowest level modifier of an item? The thing is, you have to completely min-max the fun out of the game to make rewards like these feel valuable, and I hate how stifled my character progression feels as a result. I do like picking up items off the ground and having the potential to upgrade them, but the sad truth is, because the game is balanced around Trade League, it's orders of magnitude more cost effective for me to hoard my currency and use it to buy better gear than it is to find something and pray to RNGesus that I hit good modifiers. It only really makes sense to use certain forms of crafting materials when I'm already ahead, or if the costs are negligible, like with orbs of augmentation and transmutation. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to these kinds of problems because certain players prefer different things, whether it be RNG or something more akin to the crafting system of Path of Exile 1. As for myself, I would much rather prefer a system like what's found in Last Epoch, where you can dismantle gear down to their component parts and forge their modifiers onto other pieces of equipment up to a set limit. Loot found on the ground still retains a lot of value in that game because the highest tiers of modifiers can't be crafted, and you can always dismantle what isn't good, so you're still incentivized to leave zones with a full inventory. Of course, it would be hard to tell how such a system would fare in Path of Exile 2, and there's always the potential you'd still get better items on average from trading than crafting your own, but at the very least, having a more deterministic system would allow players the chance to stay in the game and tailor their gear to fit their build rather than relying on the RNG of finding decent base gear, currency, and gambling away said currency on their items without pricking them. Beyond that, although the devs have said they wanted item drops to be more meaningful to the player, there are too many items which drop that are of no value to the player even if they're trading, making it so that they're heavily incentivized to use loot filters. I think this is a sign that the range of items which can drop relative to your level is way too high, and it can feel particularly frustrating when you're trying to farm higher tier waystones but you're consistently getting low tier waystones in return. This truthfully doesn't bother me too much, but it's an easy example to point to because it's a lot more intuitive to understand how it sucks to get a tier 2 waystone when you're clearing tier 15 maps than it is comparing one random item base type to another. And keep in mind, this is going to be compounded further when they manage to add in the base items that aren't in the game already, so things like daggers, swords, spears, and flails. Maybe things could be salvaged a bit more if we had better crafting options, like being able to change the chaos damage of the cultist bow from earlier into physical damage, or ways to directly modify the tiers of modifiers on an item. But the cynic in me is afraid GGG will keep things mostly as they are. Even if they do, I'll still probably play Path of Exile 2 here and there, but it just really sucks knowing I'd enjoy the game that much more if things were a little bit different. The players will keep coming back if the game is fun,
which it is.
But I think the current state of loot, trading, and the gatekeeping of its endgame content is going to be a real stain on it until it's addressed in the future. Perhaps one kind of stopgap they can fit in the meantime would be adding more merchants into the game and allowing players the ability to manually reroll their inventories with some gold, since it kind of sucks they only refresh on level up. Either way, I think they're going to have a really difficult time balancing loot and currency drops between the single player environment and multiplayer one. Now, with all that said, I have to repeat many of the criticisms others have had in regard to the endgame mapping system. Right now, some maps are too big, and it sucks having to find and kill all the rare monsters in each one to complete them. I'd rather there be more variety in the types of maps we have, their sizes, and the ways they could be completed. So for example, if you have a map with a ritual in it, it'd be nice if you had the choice to either clear the rituals or kill all rare monsters instead. And like many others, I was also under the impression that boss maps would just have a boss within them, so I was a little disappointed to learn that boss maps were essentially just the regular maps from Path of Exile 1. I know the endgame content is the last thing they put into the game and it's very unpolished, so I'm really not too worried about it, but I may as well put my hat in the ring and say I'd really like it if we had multiple types of boss maps. So for example, I'd really like it if some boss maps just had one gigantic boss to face, and others had 3 or 4 smaller ones to take down sequentially. It'd also be worth considering maybe having a type of boss map where you'd have to fight 2 bosses at once in addition to the more normal PoE 1 style maps. Anyway, some maps suck. I know Augury is probably the one at the top of most people's hate lists, but I honestly didn't have too much of a problem with it until I realized you could totally get a version of Augury that has burning ground which can be placed right where you need to stand to pull a lever. So yeah, that really sucks. And if they want to have these kinds of maps in the game, they need to reconsider having safe zones against environmental hazards like that, as well as letting players have the ability to dodge cancel out of extended animations, or better yet, not have them be a factor to map completion at all. Other maps have too many choke points or line of sight issues that can really destroy some builds, and it always sucks to get killed from an effect you couldn't see coming. Hidden Grotto seems to be ridiculously large and really annoying to traverse for some reason, and I legitimately just wanted to dip out of a Willow map the first time I ran it because I couldn't see what was going on through so much foliage in the air and on the ground, and it sucked trying to navigate the terrain via the minimap. It doesn't help that it can be really awkward landing some of the mercenary skill shots where the Z-axis is involved, so its hills can also be pretty terrible to deal with. Like so many others, I'd have to agree the tower maps are lackluster and tedious, and the prowling shades which inhabit these maps are probably my least favorite in the entire game. And on that note, I'd really wish for GGG to balance or cull some rare modifiers on specific enemy types, because it's beyond unfun trying to fight a Devourer with a periodic invulnerability aura and proximal tangibility when it immediately tries to dive back underground when you actually get close to it. In addition to that, I'd prefer that some mods not stack at all, like proximal tangibility and releases periodic explosions, because it can be really rough trying to discern when they're about to explode if your character and skills visual effects are cluttering the screen. But with that being said, I'll echo the common sentiment and say it would be nice if we had opacity sliders for player and enemy effects. I'm probably one of the few who doesn't mind on-death effects, but before you hit the dislike button, hear me out. On-death effects aren't bad, but I think the ones currently in the game could be improved. It's almost universally agreed that the big dudes who stop to explode are pretty decent and fair, but almost no one thinks about the giant beetles that burst into a swarm of tiny mosquitoes after they die. On-death effects can be cool if you can interact with them, but you can't really do that with the vast majority of the ones in Path of Exile 2. You know those little dudes who drop the annoying pools of blood after they die? What if you could get rid of that blood if you used the cold skill, which would turn into chilled ground you could use against other enemies? The purple zombies that explode into a poisonous purple mist? Why can't we ignite that poisonous cloud? And so on and so forth. Right now, all the most egregious on-death effects result in explosions that can't be interacted with in any way beyond trying to avoid them. It's also partially why I dislike the volatile plants which shoot out purple orbs which force you to step out of the way. What if you could hit them away from you or back into enemies if you had a spell or a skill with the knockback modifier? This would give players more of a reason to have a variety of different skills on their skill bars, and I'd actually be excited to see certain modifiers appear on enemies. As it is right now, the secret tech to avoid the vast majority of on-death effects is to use a skill to freeze or shatter your enemies so the on-death effect doesn't occur in the first place. I don't have a good segue for this part of the video, so... Ascendancies. Some are good, some are bad, but what we can all agree on is that getting them sucks. GGG's already received tons of feedback on this front that I don't want to reiterate, so instead I want to give you all a PSA. For whatever reason, you can't actually pause the game when you're facing the final boss on the 4th floor of the Trials of the Sekima, and I wouldn't be surprised if the same is true for the Trials of Chaos, but there's no indication anywhere in the game that this would be a thing, especially since the pause button functions normally elsewhere throughout the trial, so I thought I'd say something here. I'll keep things relatively spoiler-free, but I did die twice to the Sekima final boss because I tried pausing it once, and another time due to my UI covering a critical part of the screen. Although I've generally been fine with the camera angle, because of what happened with the Sekima final boss, I do have to echo others' feedback that it'd be nice to be able to zoom the camera out a bit further to have an easier time keeping track of what some bosses are doing when they're off screen. Aside from that, while I'm fine with the idea of having to do the Trial of the Sekimas or the Trial of Chaos, I hate how long they actually take to do and how much of my run seems determined by RNG. Hell, even if there were a version of the trials that didn't have RNG, I'd still be annoyed at how long it takes actually running through them. With that being said, I still like that the trials exist and are farmable, but it really sucks getting to the end of one only to get insta-gibbed by being unable to pause for a mechanic you don't understand, or getting killed because of something hidden behind your UI. It would be nice if for Ascendancies and Pinnacle bosses that you were given a non-consumable token to face these challenges that only went away once you completed them. Perhaps that would alleviate some of the suffering to farm these things out in the first place, but for me, I don't really mind that you only have one death to clear maps as it does introduce some consequences to the system, but I would agree with virtually everyone else that it is too punishing, to the point it'll actively drive players away. It might also be worth considering having Waystones drop back down to normal rarity instead of being deleted, so that way even if you're set back, your progression isn't actively being regressed. A system like this would still be punishing, yet it would allow players the chance to learn Pinnacle fights without looking up guides or the pressure of feeling like it needs to be cleared or that they should just sell their run. Maybe it'll also spare them the pain of having to purchase maps on the trade site to fuel their progression, which reminds me. If Doriani sells blank Tier 1 Waystones from the shop, they should really consider letting him sell maps of other tiers, or at least letting us re-roll his inventory with gold because there's no way players will reforge literally millions of Waystones just to get one Tier 15 map. Some other things I'd like to touch on are that I wish we had more visual feedback for what buffs or debuffs are currently influencing our character. For example, when I use the Momentum Support Gem to give me 40% more damage for the duration of a skill, it's currently unclear to me how long that buff lasts and whether or not I need to reproc it multiple times depending on what clip of ammo I'm currently using. The same thing goes for the nodes on the passive skill tree that give me more evasion when I roll and things like that. I know we also sort of have a damage calculator built into the game, which is nice, but it's not fully functional on the skill tree and some abilities aren't tracked on it at all like grenades and explosive shot, though a part of me does think it's kind of funny to mouse over a plus 12% grenade damage node only for nothing to show up at all. I'm not sure, but because it seems like things aren't being accurately reflected in their damage calculations, I'm afraid outside tools like Path of Building will still become the default suggestion for people to use to examine their builds despite GGG's best efforts. It doesn't help that it isn't always consistent the way that DPS is presented for each ability, so I wouldn't blame someone for thinking that an ability like Fragmentation Rounds does no damage because it shows the DPS of one projectile instead of the 10 it actually fires. Because of stuff like this, it'd be nice for newer players if we had multiple DPS display options on the main tab instead of just in the advanced one. Oh, and before I forget, please let us be able to search which gems are socketed where on our character sheets in the future. I really like the idea behind the weapon swap system, but it does feel kind of lame that there's a weapon swap speed stat on the passive skill tree, and that if it's supposed to be important, there's so few of them. That isn't really a big deal though. What I'd really like to offer feedback on is that it's a little unintuitive figuring out how weapon swapping is supposed to work, so rather than having the weapon swap UI hidden behind skill gem menus, it would be better if we also had a tab at the top of the skill sheet to select between weapon slots 1, 2, or both. Beyond that, I think the weapon swapping mechanic is really interesting, and even if you're just using one weapon archetype, you can still get a lot of utility from the system by having a weapon to focus on something like single target damage versus AoE, or buffing one element over the other. I think this is an S-tier addition to the game, but it could use a little more tutorialization, especially with how it interacts with the passive skill tree. As for gems, I really enjoy not having to recolor my sockets, but it feels like they drop a little too scarcely during the campaign. I know Kriparian touched on this in one of his videos, but since he was leveling Summon Raging Spirits as his primary source of damage, he really got screwed in Act 2 because you hardly ever see spirit gems drop. And after I heard that from him, it made me remember how much slower my progression was during parts of Act 2 on my Mercenary where I kept getting skill gems but no support gems for them. My Monk on the other hand got plenty of support gems, so I felt like there was no issue at all. Nonetheless, a lot of progression throughout the campaign is dictated by the individual's access to gems, so maybe it should be worth considering adding a few gems to the shopkeeper's inventories to ensure there's a more linear progression curve for some players during the campaign. I should also mention that with how rarely Jeweler's Orbs drop, it can feel pretty bad trying to switch away from a gem you've already upgraded, and I'd almost prefer having character sockets instead. The last bit of feedback I have pertains to playing with a controller on a console. I was pleasantly surprised at how good the game felt, at least for a melee class, but I did run into a couple issues. Sometimes I'd automatically lock on to the temple bell with my Monk even if I was inputting the complete opposite direction on my analog stick, and that became quite annoying, but targeting everything else felt mostly fine. The biggest piece of feedback I have regarding controller support is that it feels like the current amount of keybinds feels a little limited, which can make using the controller a little awkward, and I'd really love it if we had more buttons we could use to hot swap skills, so that way if I held X, square, triangle, or circle, I could have different functions for my shoulder buttons. I'd also like it if we had the ability to add more keybinds for shop functions on PC, since the controller users have access to some nice quality of life features like being able to select different shop options with individual buttons. Having crossplay and cross-progression between console and PC was really nice, but I should also give a word of warning to those wanting to play on PS5. None of the microtransactions carry over between PC and PS5, so if you're banking on using your stash tabs from one platform to the other, they become remove only, which sucks, but could be worse. This isn't a problem for Xbox, so send the blame Sony's way. But that reminds me, right now, for whatever reason, switching between PC and PS5 also rearranges my stash tabs and deletes their affinities, which is really annoying to fix every time I switch between platforms. The way that I rate games is based on a bell curve, with a 5 being an average, fun, enjoyable game. 4s and below are reserved for games that are flawed or actively predatory toward the player, and 6s and above are for games that stand a cut progressively above the rest. In my mind, a 10 is nearly unattainably perfect, with there being absolutely nothing I'd want to change or think could be done to improve it. With this in mind, I'd give Path of Exile 2's early access launch a 7 out of 10. Honestly, I think Path of Exile 2 has a really strong foundation and will easily be an 8 out of 10 once it gets rebalanced and more content added to the game. I can even see it becoming a 9 out of 10 game for me if they address some of my biggest complaints about character progression and clamping down on the disparity between the wealth generated by the highest tiers of players and the lowest. Like I said at the start of the video, a lot of the so-called major problems in Path of Exile 2 do seem like they can be addressed fairly easily, which is reassuring, so only time will tell how things actually shape up when the game fully releases. If you enjoyed the video, let me know with a like, comment, or sub, and if there's opinions I have you disagree with, I'd also like to hear about it. I know the video is skewed maybe a bit too heavily on the negative side, but I do genuinely think it's important to have these kinds of conversations to hopefully push it in a more positive direction. I also plan on making a few more videos talking about things like the state of classes or other proposed quality of life fixes, so if you guys are interested in that kind of thing, be sure to subscribe, and if you think I've forgotten anything, let me know in the comments below. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons and channel members for their continued support in helping sustain the channel's growth, and you for watching to the end of the video. So how are you guys feeling about Path of Exile 2? Mostly positive? Somewhat negative? A mix of both? Is there anything in particular you're looking forward to? I know I'm really looking forward to the addition of the Ray Spectre skill gem and what kind of shenanigans will come along with that, so hopefully it won't take too long to come out, but I'm also fine with waiting until it's fully ready. Anyway, that'll be it for me, so hopefully I'll catch you on the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe. Last protagonist out.